Welcome to this webinar brought to you by IUFOST. My name is Marie Latulippe and I'm the Director of Science Programs at the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences, or IUFOST. Today we are very pleased to learn more about the work of an IUFOST task force focused on processing for nutrition and health. And the IUFOST recommendations were debuted at the IUFOST meeting in Italy that was held in September 2024. So for those that were unable to attend that meeting, this is a great opportunity to hear about this work and to ask a few questions. Just as a reminder, IUFOST is a nonprofit organization that advances food and nutrition science for public benefit, and we do that by bringing together scientists from different sectors that decide what their common research interests are and then activate programs around those interests. And as an organization, IUFOST funds research and we convene experts to deliver a wide variety of products, and those include competitively funded research, workshops, dialogues, and then related peer-reviewed publications from that work. IUFOST is actually keenly interested in learning about the IUFOST process and thinking, and that is in particular to inform our activity in this space. And you can see the title here, which is to develop science-based principles for classifying foods based on processing and formulation for public health. And this group is looking to identify some areas of alignment with respect to what evidence is needed if one wants to classify foods based on processing and formulation. And if you have an interest in learning more about this work and this group, please do reach out to us. And I'm quite pleased to provide an introduction for our speaker today, Dr. Eric Windhab. He's a Professor Emeritus of Food Process Engineering at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. And Professor Windhab's research priorities are fluid technological processes for microstructuring of multi-phase systems, mainly in the food-related field. And he connects the domains of rheology, fluid dynamics, microstructuring analysis, and process or apparatus development. And Dr. Windhab joins us today in his role as co-chair of the IUFOST task force. I should say that's the International Union of Food Science and Technology, the task force on processing for nutrition, diet, and health. So he is going to share the thinking of this group and the resulting recommendations.
And welcome everybody to this presentation on the IUFOST task force report on processing for nutrition, diet, and health. So my colleagues from the task force, I will also introduce them a bit more in detail at the end of the presentation, but Lilia Arne, Hongda Chen, J.R. Henry, Yu-Song Kim, and Barbara Schneemann. And I will report about the results of a work which has lasted for about 2 years to enter into looking more closely into the NOVA classification and trying to refine it in a way that confusion, ambiguities could be, let's say, left out and bridged by what we developed. So my presentation will be shared within the following chapters, just to give you a bit of an overview. So first, the boundary conditions, how we should go for a food product classification to do it systematically. Then summarize the NOVA classification analysis we did. I will not go into details of the analysis as such, because many of you may have already dealt with NOVA, but give you the resume of the task force as the base, what we tried to tackle. Differentiation of quantification and quantification of formulation and process is very key part in order to kind of get out of these some confusing elements of the NOVA classification and go develop an independent way which is more clear and quantified. Then the IUFOST formulation and processing classification scheme, which is the result, let's say, of this interaction with the NOVA scheme and finding the new ways to better quantify and better differentiate between formulation and processing. And finally, giving you a summary and task force recommendations, a bit of an outlook. So let me start with the boundary conditions and explain this with a scheme. So when we go for classification, we have to know what is our characteristics. In our case, the food characteristics according to which we want to classify. And we decided certainly for the nutrition value because this is related to what NOVA at the end of the day claims to connect to some health and obesity risk. But we have to be aware that there is other important food properties like safety, sustainability, palatability, affordability, convenience, which are of importance when you develop a food. However, the focus for this part of the task force work is certainly the nutrition value. What you see here on the bottom of my slide is what we call an extended food value chain, which really starts from harvesting raw materials via the processing, via the point of purchase, where the consumer is certainly purchasing the food, which we took as the base for our classification, and then via the point of consumption, it goes into digestive and metabolic response steps of the human body, let's say up to a point of living of the human being. But our focus is certainly when processing plays a role before the point of purchase. So what is the processing steps which are involved? And what I show you here, what you always need when you want to classify is classification parameters. I just abbreviated them here with a CP. So are there classification parameters which we can apply to the processes till the point of purchase? Because this is where a NOVA classification, which I will always take a bit into account at the beginning for comparison and for analysis of what could be done better. So the point of purchase is the point where we want to classify the food. However, what NOVA has taken into, or at least brought into the discussion, is that processing plays a role, at least the designations in the NOVA scheme, as I will come to, are, let's say, going for processing or processed or ultra processed type of food. When we look at typical classification parameters, this could be nutrient concentrations. Think about nutrient profiling. So this is where nutrient concentrations give us information about the nutrition value or how to define a nutrition value. And then we will certainly try to build the bridge to what's at the end of this extended food value chain, because we wanted to know the outcome. What is the benefit of a certain quality, a certain class of foods in terms of nutrition value. Now, when you look at these properties, so we have to see in the context of processing, this is what typically somebody faces who wants to process a food and then has this kind of hexagon of different properties. And the question is, which is the property of preference? For us, it will be the nutrition value. But just to give you an idea, if you would like to, for example, optimize shelf life, let's assume in this spider web, so the black curve is representing the characteristic pattern of a certain food, a hypothetical food in this case, but you wanted to optimize shelf life, long shelf life product, then you see this would be the result of the processing, because a typical way to process if you want to have super long shelf life is certainly having the microbiology cut down to close to a full extent, and this is where thermal sterilization would be the measure to go for. But thermal sterilization may make you suffer from losses of vitamins, and accordingly the nutrition value may a bit suffer, and also maybe the palatability may suffer if you have this long shelf life products. So when you look at the resulting patterns of these foods, the blue one would have an optimized, as you see in this corner, shelf life. An other more gentle one could optimize for the nutrition value, like a high pressure pasteurization, and so this would be more gentle, this with an optimized characteristics for the nutrition value. And that means, you always have to balance what is your favorite optimization criterion, and accordingly one would typically balance processing in a way as just shown here with a simple example of comparing these two processes, which would shift the profile related to all these properties, not only to the nutrition value, but certainly affecting the nutrition value in terms of either be optimized or be compromised maybe sometimes if something else like the long shelf life is in the forefront of optimization. Now, when we go for the nutrition value, and this is for us key, we have to start with, because we want to have a science-based quantification scheme or quantitative scheme. And so we were looking at Nutri-Score, health star rating, different in different regions. There is different, let's say, of these schemes for nutrition profiling. And we thought, after our analysis, the Nutrition-Rich Food Index, which has been developed in the US around 2010, from Adam Darnowski in Washington. So we thought this is very good from a science-based, from a quantification, from flexibility perspective. And so we take this as an example for how the nutrient profiling, in order to get a classification property parameter available, so to use nutrient-rich food index as for the quantification of the nutrition value. So what is it? Just in brief, we have disqualifying agents and qualifying agents. So the qualifying agents are the recommended ones, like proteins, like minerals, like vitamins. The disqualifying ones may be added sugar, salt, saturated fats, some specific type of additives. And accordingly, what you're doing is you sum up, let's say, what you have as masses here. For the green, it would be the qualifying nutrients, the masses of each of these nutrients related to the recommended daily intake value. And this is what you, for the disqualifying nutrients, it would be the maximum tolerated value related to. So you have relative values, and if you have 9 qualifying and 3 disqualifying of these nutrients included in your formulation, so you would have an NRF 9.3. You choose a base, a portion base, which can be 100 kilocalories or grams, or the serving portion, but this is a dimensionless number because you divide it masses. It's always relative to the daily intake mass, and then you get dimensionless numbers between theoretically minus 200 and plus 300. You are on the minus side with sugared beverages, for example. You are on the very much plus side with some fresh citrus fruits and so forth. So this is roughly how you can then form the difference between the recommended and the to be limited nutrient numbers, and then you get these quantified nutritive value, nutrition value of your formulation. As I mentioned, the adaptability, the flexibility of the NRF, I will refer to this, and the coupling with energy density aspects, nutrient density, cost factors. So this is a very flexible way to do it, and this is why we have been choosing this. So based on this, having the nutrition value of a formulation quantified, so we had to also say what are we expecting from processing. So this is a view angle of the food process engineers, typically on the upper left corner here. So I just describe it. Processing is typically targeted to product property generation by structure modulation. So typically, to understand and to quantify, we can say process makes structure, and structure encodes properties. So this is how the connection, I mean, you may say this is a typical food engineering part, process structure relationships, and the material science, the food material science relationship is the structure property parts. What we want to harvest at the end is certain properties of consumer relevance, like what they prefer, what they accept, what they need. So under the needs, we would have nutrition and health. Sometimes consumer profiling by these so-called PAN profiles. The preferences, the acceptances, and the needs is done. On top, sustainability, techno-functional aspects play a role, but the nutrition value is now in the forefront. So what are the unit operations and the processing principles which can generate structures which are best for optimizing nutrition and health-related characteristics? This would be the background from a process understanding perspective. Now let me come to the summary of the NOVA classification analysis. You may know, many of you who have dealt with NOVA. NOVA is, let's say, in the NOVA groupings, there is appearing non-processed, processed, ultra-processed, minimally processed first. And so that means it looks from non to minimally to processed to ultra processed, that there is a kind of degree of processing behind. However, when you go into the NOVA scheme, you find that there is addition of sugar, salt, saturated fats, so-called cosmetic processed ingredients. So nothing about the processing as such. That means you build process-related designated groups, but the criteria to enter into these groups is formulation, because adding sugar, salt, saturated fats, certain types of additives, this is certain formulation. And this is why certainly we have this confusion of formulation and processing, which is a problem with the NOVA scheme, and identified as one of the key problems in our listing of problems. The second one is the lack of quantification, because neither the processing, it's not even, let's say, tried to be quantified in any way, but also the formulation, because adding sugar, adding salt, adding additives is not quantified. Just the appearance of an additive name in the recipe, in the formulation, is qualifying for ultra processed, for example. So it's a bit confusing and very hard to apply it. So as a second big issue. Then conflicting issues with nutritional advice. So when we go for, let's say, additives, for example, we have, and you think about Codex Alimentarius, so there is a lot of conflicting issues aspects as well. I want to focus on this, and we did in the task force focus on these first two and the third as well, main issues, and asking the questions. First one, how can the confusion in using a formulation processing be tackled, and the lack of this quantification? And the second one, what about, let's say, the conflicting aspects with existing systems of nutrient profiling for recommendation of their dietary guidelines? Let me come to this. So the first step we did is in differentiating quantification and formulation, and quantification of formulation and processing by clear definitions. So the definitions to clearly differentiate for the formulation is systematic selection of relative quantities of ingredients for a food product. That means kind of creating a recipe, a formulation is the selection of the quantities of ingredients. And processing is the treatment of a formulation, let's say, or of a recipe, treatment of a food material or a combination of food materials to achieve a desired effect. With this, we had clearly separated and simply and in short terms defined formulation and processing. And now the question came, how can we quantify this? Because you remember with the NRF, with the Nutrition Rich Food Index, we quantified our target property, which is the nutrition value of a food. And I mean, this can certainly characterize according to what's done in some nutrition profiling. This can certainly already characterize the formulation. So, but what about the quantification also of a process aspect? Because formulation is fine, following the rules of nutrition profile or nutrient profiling. So what did we find for the quantification of processing? And for this, I just want to guide you a bit, that you see this is not a strange thing to be done. So we looked for methodologies of process analysis, which we as food scientists, food engineers would typically use, and go for the analysis of balance equations. This sounds very basic, but it's also very simple to understand, because you all may have heard about energy balances or mass balances, and what they are doing very simply. Our system is a process, and some energy goes into the process and some energy content comes out of the process, or some mass goes into the process, some mass comes out of the process. And if there is some mass accumulated, like in a system, so there is a difference in the masses, or a delta mass, and the same can happen to the energy. So you have a consumption of energy in the system, or a generation of maybe thermal energy, so you have a delta energy. And that means you just do a balance, what goes in, what goes out, and the difference is the delta. And exactly this principle we use now for the NRF, for the nutrition value we have quantified by the NRF 9.3 as an example. We say the ingredients before processing which go in, they have an NRF 9.31, and the system that comes out, the treated ingredients or ingredient mixture, has an NRF 9.32. And accordingly, with the NRF, we have certainly the characterization of the formulation as it goes in. And with a delta NRF, that means the difference what as an NRF goes in and comes out. So we have with this delta NRF a clear information, a quantitative information about what happens in the process with respect to our nutrition value. So we have the same base NRF to characterize the formulation and a delta NRF to characterize the process for the treatment of such a formulation. So this is the base which we started with, and then we wanted to certainly have a look how are we placed, what is the positioning in the NOVA context. So again, let me, in the background, we have this extended food value chain, and now we see the processing. Let's say there may be processing of the raw materials and during the food manufacture until the point of purchase. So this is the point where also a NOVA classification would start. The NOVA classification just groups into the 4 groups mentioned before: the non or minimally processed food, the processed ingredients, the processed food, and the ultra processed food. And then builds, I mean, there was a development certainly in the NOVA scheme, and in the later stage, so there was more and more pronounced, and this is what scientists who are in favor with NOVA also trying more and more, like building the bridge, what we call food impact correlation to, let's say, correlated obesity and health risk aspects. So this is a frame which we did not intend to tackle from a task force, IUFOST task force perspective, but we have the overlap in how to characterize the food at the point of purchase. And we think that what NOVA is doing is very weak characterization here. And if you have a weak base, you have a weak correlation, or you weaken a possible correlation anyhow. So this is how a task force frame and an intended, or the NOVA frame, are kind of placed along such a extended food value chain. And what I already referred to before is now we can have an NRF for characterizing our system at the point of purchase. We can characterize an NRF before a processing step or processing steps, and we can make this delta NRF as a consequence or as a quantitative characteristics of what happens in processing. So this is what we did. So now how did we develop based on this now what we call an IUFOST formulation processing classification scheme, because we want to handle this in a well-defined way. So for this, the only slide I'm facing you with some equations, but which can be simply explained, and partially I already introduced them before. So because the NRF, as we already mentioned, so now I choose the base of 100 kilocalorie portion is the recommended, like 9 of the nutrients, and the limited, like 3 of the nutrients. So the difference between the two is the NRF as introduced before. So we have relative values because the masses of the nutrients divided by the daily intake for the recommended ones, the mass of the nutrient which is not recommended divided by the mass of maximum value tolerated or recommended value of, let's say, sugar or salt, saturated fats, and so forth. So we have a clear definition. This is approved since more than a decade as a classification or nutrient profiling classification for formulations, for a recipe, let's say, for a composition of food. Then we have seen the delta NRF after processing minus NRF before processing gives us the delta as a characteristics of what happens in the processing with our quantified nutrition value. And now I do the following step, because it is clear when you have a scheme which uses 2 parameters, the NRF for formulation and the delta NRF for processing, you make the system certainly a bit more complex, because now you have a 2 parametric type of evaluation of your system for the future, because we said we need a scheme which can also be re-simplified to bring these two together. That means to redefine a coupled parameter. So we did so by a so-called formulation and processing food index. And you see it couples NRF, which is the formulation characteristics, and delta NRF. So it's a coupled parameter. Why there is a 2, why there is an A and a B constant inside, this is only related to making it nicely visible or representing it in a diagram, which I will show you in the next slide. So but what should be understood, to clearly differentiate between formulation and processing, we need two separate quantitative parameters. For formulation NRF, for the processing delta NRF. In the case you want to re-simplify and bring the two quantitatively designed parameters together to a one parameter system again, you can do this type of coupling. I will explain the advantages because we base it now on quantitative characterization of the formulation and the processing. Now, what I show you here is exactly this scheme. We call it a classification matrix diagram. And you see now my formulation parameter, NRF93, on the x-axis, and the processing parameter, delta NRF, on the y-axis. You see already the coupling parameter is inside here. So this is this kind of inclined lines by 45 degrees, which go into this direction. I come to this later. But first of all, how can we see the development of a formulation or the impact of a process in such a diagram? Let's assume we have a formulation P1, so characterized by this point, which is not processed. We start with such a formulation, so we are from a delta NRF perspective on the 0 line. 0 line means not processed. And now we just change the formulation. We play with the formulation. If we would add sugar or some of the non-recommended nutrients, if we would add this, we would certainly reduce the quality and the nutrition value of our formulation. So we would shift, still no processing inside, no processing involved. So we would shift to a point P2, which is due to the addition of added sugar, for example. If we would go the opposite, if we would enrich in components with higher amount of nutrients or vitamins, we would do the opposite. So an F plus green arrow, it goes to the right. So we increase our formulation NRF, nutrient-rich food index value here. Now, as soon as processing comes into the play, so we certainly have also a delta NRF. And let's start again for the P1 and go for a process which is certainly maybe, like I mentioned before, some heat treatment process which makes us lose some vitamins. So we would go along a 45-degree inclined line here downwards to the lower left and to a point P3. So that means we would reduce certainly our nutrition value. If we could do the opposite, let's say enrich by a concentration process, we can, let's say, concentrate some of the desirable nutrients by a concentration process, we would certainly go up here. So, but due to the fact that we have now a change in the NRF and the delta NRF, so we move along these inclined lines. This could certainly also happen after having chosen another recipe with sugar and then applying a process. So you can, in principle, play with the superposition of processes and changes in formulation. Something which is here from the point P3, after having, let's say, lost some components, you may say if regulations would allow, let's say, for food fortification in developing countries or whatever. So, but this has to be certainly clearly decided whether this is allowed. You may add some ingredients in order to fortify, in order to then move after processing to a better point. But this is certainly to be adjusted to the regulations. So horizontal lines are always formulation impact. Inclined lines by the 45 degrees are the way you move, let's say, in this diagram for processing impacts. Green is the improvements, red is the deteriorations, as just explained. Now, the FPFI, so the formulation and processing food index values, they have these inclined lines. You see when you go to the positive direction with the process, you are rectangular to these lines of ISO FPFI, of constant FPFI values. So you have a strong impact on this coupled parameter, which is the quantitative combination of what happens for the formulation and for the processing, coupled with respect to the nutrition to the nutrition value. So to bring a bit substance to this, let's look at examples. Now you see the diagram with some examples. I try to explain this. Take a raw carrot. You are pretty high up in the NRF. It's a healthy and high nutrition value. Now, if you would cook the carrot, so you would certainly lose some vitamins, and so this means you would go to the lower left, as just explained before. If you would say, I want to treat the carrots because I want to prepare glazed carrots, you would add some sugar. So adding sugar to this formulation would certainly make you shift your point P1 to the P2, so you reduce the nutrition value by the added sugar. If you then cook the carrots, so then you end up at a point here, which is certainly shifted by this added sugar vector here to a point P3 here. I give you another examples, and these are data from let's say, Food and Nutrient Database for Dietary Studies, USDA base. And if you go for like a pea protein isolate, so a concentration of proteins, so since the proteins will be a desirable nutrient, if you can do this in a process where you don't lose too much of micronutrients, for example, so you improve, let's say, by this type of processing to a higher value of NRF, or even better when you look at the combined parameter FP, FI. The N superscript stands for nutrition value, so that we can differentiate this. So you would increase in this direction the most, because you have these rectangular isolines to these vectors of improvement of a process. You can play through with applesauce. There is not too many examples from the databases, because sometimes there is at the same time processing changed and formulation changed. So we will need in the future to collect more data where we say this is the processing part and the same and this is the formulation part, and basing it on the same raw materials, just that we do not compare apples and pears. So, but this is exactly what you can do with also then showing that these FPFIN, so this formulation and processing food index, could also be underlaid with a color scheme. So if you want to have a traffic light system or something like this in the future, because the re-simplified one parameter version, but based on quantified formulation and processing parameters, this could certainly be then also re-dimensioned by within a color scheme if you wanted to go this way to make it more illustrative for consumers. But we have not been approaching on front label kind of characteristics. But I mean, the development of a scheme should allow for this simplification in order to not run against the wall if once this is discussed and should be addressed. Now, my last part of the presentation should show you, because we do not want to get captured, let's say, by a certain frame of characterizing the nutritive value of a formulation of a product. And this is why I show you, and this is what I mentioned also at the beginning as flexibility of the nutrition-rich food index. What you see here, you said the formulation can be characterized by the NRF, by the nutrition-rich food index, which is the recommended minus the limited numbers of nutrients or dimensionless numbers by the mass ratios, which I explained before. Now, that means we would only have a change in this NRF if we have more or less recommended or more or less to be avoided nutrients. But you can widen this. You can add terms. One term would be something which is highly relevant for nutrition. It's anti-nutrients. Like if you had some phytate, some phytic acids in some crop-based, plant-based products. So the anti-nutrients can, in principle, inhibit uptake of some of your nutrients. They can inhibit protein uptake, micronutrient complexation can happen. So it would be very favorable to have such a term included into a formulation aspect, because if this term could be reduced, you see, then we get a bigger NRF. So reduction of such an anti-nutrient term by inactivation of these anti-nutrients would increase the value of our formulation. Now, inactivation is a measure of processing. Inactivation by heat, inactivating by separation treatments of such anti-nutrients. And this is why, like explained before, the deltas, what goes in, what goes out of the process. If I have ingoing anti-nutrients, outgoing anti-nutrients, if there is a delta, I can see whether my process is able to reduce anti-nutrients. And in this way, I could add other terms for nutrition value relevant characteristics in my formulation, but then also a delta of this in the processing, because between the in and the out of a process, there may be a difference. So you see, this is what we call extensibility and widening, let's say, to a wider frame of use. The final part is transferability, because now I would like to remind you to my initial statement on that we not only have the nutrition value as a characteristics, but we also have sustainability, palatability, safety, and we might even go into digestibility, which is so far not yet addressed in these main categories. But I want just to demonstrate to you, like we treated the nutrition value from a formulation and as a delta, as NRF, and as delta NRF for the processing, we could do it with similar appropriate parameters for other product properties. Like for sustainability, if I would take the global warming potential, I can say I can characterize my formulation according to a global warming potential. And if I process this formulation, what is the delta? You can always say, yes, the process will add some energy consumption, so it may have a larger global warming potential. But if you use different processes, this may be different. So you can select the processes which are less adding global warming potential. So by the delta, by the smaller delta. Let me make also the complex example for digestibility. If I had in my formulation proteins which have a certain state of nativity or being partially, let's say, denatured, so I can characterize this by methodologies, PDCAS, DIAS, or analysis methodologies. I can, in principle, characterize, quantify the digestibility characteristics of a protein. Now, if I process such a protein, I may denature more, and then I have a delta PDCAS or a delta diet. So I have changed the digestibility of a protein. Some of you may know that somehow changed protein nativity so can improve digestibility. So you see, I can apply, and I could play through with the other parameters. I can apply, let's say, these formulation related and then processing with the delta value related characterization, quantitative characterization. I can extend this also to other product property characteristics. And finally, what I can do in the same way as I showed for the nutrition value, I could do the coupling to a single parameter, which are always called now food processing, food index, and just the superscript is then related to the product property mentioned here. Okay, with that, I come to my summary, because I wanted to summarize what can we do with that, also with respect to the NOVA. And I should mention here, so our let's say attitude towards NOVA was not that we wanted to demonize or let's say only look at the issues and the problems, but we said, okay, can we build the bridge? Can we refine NOVA? Can we regain, let's say, also part of the community which is supporting the NOVA classification by showing how we can avoid ambiguities, avoid the confusion, because more and more the people and those who want to apply the NOVA feel that there is quite some issues and problems in applying it. So we are ready to build the bridge and say, how can we improve? And this is why my scheme here says measures M1 to M5, how to improve. So as I mentioned when I showed you this diagram first, we have a base for the nutrition value characterization at a point of purchase. And this is where NOVA and also our scheme, the task force scheme, is focused on classifying the system. We do it now in a quantitative way by differentiating and separating formulation and processing, and by quantifying the levels for the base of a nutrition value, which is our selected target property, which is equally quantified. And we enable coupling, if necessary, of the two parameter system, if it's seen too complex, to a one parameter system by this formulation and processing food index. So these are the measures M1 to M4. You see, I placed them here. The M3, which is the quantifying levels of NRF. This is what you see for at the point of purchase, at some point before processing. When you look at the difference, this is the delta NRF for the processing, as shown here. And finally, this FPFI value as a recoupling. So we have a quantitative base which makes a clear and solid description for the classification of the nutrition value at the point of purchase. And if these are measures you could apply to NOVA to strengthen their base, to describe the classification at the point of purchase, so then you would have a stronger base position in order to correlate with obesity and health risk. So this is something where we think it might be desirable from a NOVA perspective to listen to what is suggested. And I'm adding something which is an M6, which goes hand in hand, which is, let's say, something when you look at nutrition science and food science, functional relationships, because the NOVA frame is certainly not looking into digestion, metabolism. So it's only building the bridge from the point of purchase to an end result, of diets for consumers with respect to obesity and health risk. But in between, stepping further with measures to get functional relationships for each of the digestive steps, looking at matrix effects. How is the release of nutrients from a matrix in the different steps in the GI tract and in the metabolic steps, and looking for bioaccessibility, bioavailability, quantifying this. This is certainly the way to functionalize or to base on causal relationships, evidence-based causal relationships, the digestive and the metabolic steps, in order to build this bridge such consistently that we are no longer depending on correlations with something is far away, but having these functional relationships to build a solid bridge here. So this is a complementary thing, which I think in science there is a lot of ongoing work. This will not be done tomorrow. It will last for a while to do this step by step, but I think we are on a good way to let's say, have this also considered. With this, I summarize. So this is something I don't want to read word by word, but just remind you. So the interactions between food components, ingredients, and processes can be described by the formulation and the process characterization by NRF and delta NRF. We derive this IUFOST formulation and processing classification scheme, which I showed you with this specific diagram, in which you can have the two parameter approach focused. We should certainly look in the future for interactions between additives and processes in further details. Matrix effects should be looked at, so this is recommendations. We have, let's say, also with respect to additives, which I didn't go into detail, we have first to identify harmfulness of processing treatments and of single specific ingredients before we speak about health risk, because many of the connections between point of purchase, nutrition value, and let's say what is the outcome for health and obesity risk, most is based on observational studies and not evidence-based ones. So we have to bring more evidence-based situation into this. And finally, it's certainly recommended that the food scientists from IUFOST and the food engineers with the nutritionists, they are encouraged to initiate concerted action collaborations, take FAO codex into account, maybe UNIDO, to also see, let's say, the bridging to the industrial implementation of these suggestions. So these are kind of recommendations we derive from what I showed you before. With this, I would like to stop it and thank my co-authors and task force members, Lilia Alne from Denmark, Hongla Chen from the US, Jaya Kumar Henry, Singapore, Yun Suk Kim from Korea, Barbara Schneemann from the US, President of IUFOST, Arman Yara Karthakujama and Judith Meach. And certainly thank you for your attention. And with this, I'm ready for your questions. Thanks very much.
To close, we want to encourage any of you, again, that have an interest in this topic to reach out to IFINS and learn more about our new working group. And the idea is that these principles could guide work like that done so far by IUFOST.